Many religious teachings were created in worlds that no longer exist, yet billions still follow them as if nothing has changed. Ideas about slavery, women, punishment, disease, authority, and knowledge were once presented as eternal truth, not temporary rules shaped by ancient conditions. History moved forward, but doctrine often stayed frozen. When beliefs refuse correction, they stop guiding humanity and begin limiting it. This video explores 6 teachings that once shaped civilizations, but now reveal a deeper problem. Religion struggles to adapt when reality improves. Understanding why these teachings age badly helps explain how faith can resist truth even today. Number 1. Slavery was allowed in religious law. One of the strongest examples of a religious teaching that aged badly is the acceptance of slavery inside sacred legal systems. This was not a minor cultural habit that existed outside religion. It appeared directly inside texts that believers were told came from divine authority and were meant to guide society permanently. In the Hebrew Bible, slavery is regulated rather than condemned. Exodus 21 explains how Hebrew servants could be released after several years, while foreign slaves could be owned longer. Leviticus 25 allows Israelites to purchase slaves from surrounding nations and treat them as inherited property. These rules were not written as temporary emergency policies. They were presented as part of a stable social structure that believers were expected to follow. The New Testament also does not reject slavery. Instead, passages such as Ephesians 6 instruct slaves to obey their masters. Early Christian communities lived inside the Roman Empire where slavery was widespread, yet the texts do not command believers to dismantle the system. For centuries, these passages were interpreted as confirmation that slavery could exist within a religious society. Islamic legal tradition also permitted slavery and regulated how it worked. The Quran encouraged freeing slaves as a virtuous act, but did not prohibit the institution itself. Classical Islamic law allowed slave ownership under defined conditions and described how enslaved people could be integrated into households and economies. Like earlier traditions, this system treated slavery as something that could exist inside a religious moral framework. Because these rules were presented as part of divine guidance, they shaped real societies across centuries. Religious authorities often defended slavery by arguing that if sacred law allowed it, humans did not have the authority to declare it immoral. This argument influenced debates in Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas long after slavery had already caused enormous suffering. The turning point came when moral reasoning outside religious authority began to change public thinking. Philosophers of the Enlightenment period argued that human beings possess natural rights that cannot be removed by tradition or law. Abolitionist movements then used political activism and legal reform to challenge systems that had been accepted for generations. Many religious believers joined those movements, but the justification they used increasingly relied on ideas about equality rather than obedience to ancient legal structures. This creates an important philosophical problem for the claim that sacred law represents timeless moral perfection. If a rule comes from a perfect source, it should not require correction by later generations. Yet the global rejection of slavery shows that societies eventually decided that ownership of another human being violates human dignity, regardless of whether earlier traditions allowed it. Today, almost every country in the world recognizes slavery as unacceptable. That change did not happen because ancient religious rules disappeared on their own. It happened because people began to judge old teachings using new moral standards shaped by experience, reason, and political struggle. The history of slavery shows that moral progress often occurs when societies become willing to question teachings that were once treated as permanent. Number 2. Women were given unequal status in religious law. Another religious teaching that aged badly is the idea that women should have a permanently lower status than men in family life, leadership, legal authority, and public participation. This idea appeared across multiple religious traditions and was not treated as a temporary cultural compromise. It was often presented as part of the natural order established by God. In the Hebrew Bible, women lived under strong male authority inside the household and legal system. Property rights were limited compared to men, inheritance normally passed through male lines, and religious leadership roles were overwhelmingly male. Some passages also treated women as part of household property and marriage arrangements. These rules reflected the social structure of ancient Near Eastern societies, but they were preserved inside texts that later generations treated as sacred guidance rather than historical description. Early Christianity continued many of these assumptions about gender roles. Letters attributed to Paul instructed women to remain silent in churches and to submit to male authority within marriage. Church leadership structures developed in ways that excluded women from priesthood and formal teaching authority in most traditions for centuries. These rules shaped the institutions of Christian Europe and influenced how women were educated, employed, and represented in public life. Islamic legal tradition also created structured differences between men and women in areas such as inheritance, testimony, and marriage authority. Inheritance rules typically granted women smaller shares than men, and legal testimony in certain financial contexts counted differently depending on gender. Marriage law gave husbands authority that wives did not have in equal measure. While these rules were often explained as protective or practical in their original social setting, they still established a clear legal hierarchy between genders. Because these systems were linked to divine command, they became difficult to challenge. If a rule is believed to come from God, questioning it can appear to be an act of disobedience rather than moral reflection. For long periods of history, this belief slowed attempts to expand women's legal rights and educational opportunities in societies where religious authority shaped public law. The modern shift toward gender equality developed through political reform, social movements, and philosophical arguments about universal rights rather than through direct continuity with ancient legal systems. Women gained access to voting rights, education, property ownership, and professional roles only after long campaigns that challenged earlier assumptions about their place in society. Religious institutions sometimes adapted to these changes, but adaptation usually followed social pressure rather than leading it. This historical pattern raises an important philosophical question about the claim that religious law expresses timeless moral truth. If moral rules are meant to remain valid for all generations, they should not depend heavily on social conditions that later societies reject. Yet many gender rules preserved inside sacred legal traditions reflected the expectations of ancient patriarchal cultures rather than principles that modern societies now consider fair or universal. Today, most people accept that men and women should have equal legal standing in education, employment, and political participation. This shift did not happen because ancient texts clearly predicted it. It happened because societies gradually recognized that human ability and dignity do not depend on gender. The history of women's legal status shows how religious teachings can preserve social hierarchies long after those. Hierarchies stop making sense in a changing world. Number 3. Harsh physical punishments were treated as justice. Another religious teaching that aged badly is the belief that severe physical punishment was a legitimate and necessary part of a moral society. In several major religious legal traditions, penalties such as stoning, whipping, amputation, and execution for moral or social offenses were described not only as acceptable, but as expressions of justice rooted in divine authority. In the Hebrew Bible, certain crimes were punishable by death, including adultery, blasphemy, and working on the Sabbath under specific interpretations of the law. These punishments reflected the seriousness with which religious communities protected social order and covenant identity. However, they also tied criminal justice directly to religious obedience rather than to individual rights or proportional harm. Early Christian societies inherited many of these legal assumptions through earlier scripture and later church influence. Although the New Testament itself does not present a full legal system, Christian authorities across medieval Europe supported harsh punishments for heresy, witchcraft accusations, and challenges to church authority. Religious courts sometimes worked together with political rulers to enforce penalties that were justified as necessary for preserving both faith and stability. Islamic legal tradition also preserved fixed punishments for certain offenses that were understood as violations of divine law. These punishments included public whipping for adultery in some interpretations, and amputation for theft under defined legal conditions. Classical jurists place strict evidentiary requirements on applying these penalties, but the existence of the punishments themselves showed that physical severity was considered compatible with religious justice. These legal systems developed in societies where public order depended heavily on visible enforcement and where Prisons as long-term institutions did not yet exist in the modern sense. Severe penalties were therefore seen as practical tools for deterrence. The problem is that they were not presented only as practical solutions. They were presented as moral truths that reflected the will of God. When a punishment is treated as divine justice, questioning it becomes extremely difficult. Reformers are no longer debating policy. They are confronting what believers understand to be sacred authority. This connection between punishment and divine command slowed legal reform in many societies even after new ideas about justice began to emerge. Modern legal systems gradually shifted toward the principle that punishment should be proportional, reversible when possible, and focused on protecting society rather than expressing religious obedience. Courts began to rely more on evidence, rehabilitation, and individual rights. Public executions and corporal punishments declined across many regions because people started to believe that justice should reduce harm rather than display power. This change raises an important philosophical issue about moral development. If justice is defined only by command, then any punishment declared sacred must be accepted as correct. If justice is defined partly by human reasoning about fairness and harm, then punishments must be open to revision when societies learn more about their consequences. The movement away from physical severity shows that many societies eventually chose the second path. Today, most people expect legal systems to protect dignity even when dealing with crime. That expectation did not come from preserving ancient punishments exactly as they were written. It came from centuries of debate about what justice should accomplish in a society that values human rights. The history of religious punishment laws shows how ideas once treated as sacred can lose authority when they conflict with changing understandings of fairness and responsibility. Number 4. Religious authority was placed above scientific evidence. Another teaching that aged badly is the belief that religious authority should determine what counts as truth about the natural world. In earlier societies, this idea made sense because religion was often the main source of education, law, and explanation. Over time, however, science began producing reliable methods for understanding reality, and conflict appeared whenever sacred interpretation tried to control conclusions about nature. In the ancient world, people explained disease, weather, and natural disasters through supernatural causes because they did not yet have the tools to study biology or physics in systematic ways. Religious leaders became interpreters of these events and often claimed authority over explanations of how the universe worked. These explanations were preserved in sacred traditions and repeated across generations as part of religious teaching rather than tested as hypotheses. That could change. In medieval Europe, church authorities sometimes resisted new astronomical ideas that challenged traditional interpretations of Scripture. The case of the Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei is one of the most well-known examples. His support for heliocentrism placed the Sun at the center of the solar system instead of the Earth, which conflicted with earlier interpretations that treated the Earth as fixed in place. Religious courts forced him to recant his public support for this model in the 17th century, showing how theological authority could influence the acceptance of scientific conclusions. Similar tensions appeared in other regions as well. In different historical settings, religious authorities sometimes discouraged investigation into subjects that seemed to challenge established doctrine. These conflicts were not always permanent and did not occur in every community, but they demonstrated how linking truth to sacred authority could slow acceptance of new evidence when discoveries changed earlier assumptions about the structure of the universe or the causes of illness. As scientific methods improved, societies gradually began separating religious interpretation from natural explanation. Observations could be tested, experiments could be repeated, evidence could be compared across cultures rather than accepted through tradition alone. This shift allowed medicine, astronomy, and engineering to advance in ways that were not possible when explanation depended mainly on inherited authority. The philosophical issue behind this change is important. If truth about nature comes from sacred texts alone, then discovery becomes unnecessary because the answers already exist. If truth about nature comes from observation and testing, then knowledge can grow over time as new information appears. Modern societies increasingly adopted the second approach because it produced reliable results that improved health, technology, and communication. Today, most people accept that scientific evidence should guide understanding of the physical world, even when it challenges earlier interpretations of tradition. This does not require rejecting all religious belief, but it does change the role religion can play in explaining nature. The history of conflict between authority and evidence shows that teachings which once controlled explanations of the universe became less persuasive when new methods made it possible to test claims directly and compare them with observable reality. Number 5. Apostasy was treated as a crime. Another religious teaching that aged badly is the idea that leaving a religion should be punished as a serious offense against society or even against God. In several religious traditions, changing belief was not treated as a personal decision, but as a threat to community stability, which meant punishment could be justified in legal and moral terms. In the Hebrew Bible, loyalty to the covenant community was closely tied to survival as a nation. Deuteronomy includes instructions that treated worship of other gods as a dangerous violation that could lead to severe punishment. These rules reflected a world where religion and political identity were tightly connected. So, abandoning belief was seen as weakening the entire social structure, rather than expressing individual conscience. Early Christian history also shows periods where religious authorities supported punishment for heresy or deviation from accepted doctrine. After Christianity became closely connected to state power in the Roman Empire, disagreements about belief were no longer only theological debates. They became political matters because unity of belief was treated as necessary for unity of society. In later centuries, institutions such as inquisitorial courts investigated people suspected of holding forbidden views and sometimes worked with political authorities to enforce penalties. Islamic legal tradition also treated apostasy as a serious issue connected to social order and loyalty to the community. Classical jurists debated how apostasy should be defined and addressed, but many agreed that abandoning the faith publicly could threaten stability in societies where religion functioned as both spiritual identity and legal framework. As a result, apostasy laws developed in several historical Muslim societies and influenced later legal interpretations in some regions. These systems were created in environments where religion and government were not separate institutions. Loyalty to belief often meant loyalty to law, culture, and leadership at the same time. When someone changed religion, authorities sometimes interpreted that decision as political rebellion rather than private disagreement. This explains why apostasy rules existed, but it does not explain why they should continue once societies accepted the idea of individual freedom of conscience. The modern concept of religious freedom developed through long political struggles that challenge the assumption that belief must be controlled by law. Philosophers argued that genuine faith cannot exist if it is forced, because belief loses meaning when it is required by threat rather than chosen by conviction. Over time, legal systems in many countries began protecting the right to change religion or reject religion entirely without punishment. This shift created a clear philosophical tension with older religious frameworks that treated belief as a permanent obligation rather than a personal decision. If faith must be chosen freely to be meaningful, then punishment for leaving a religion contradicts the purpose of belief itself. If faith must remain fixed regardless of evidence or experience, then it becomes difficult to separate conviction from obedience to authority. Today, many societies consider freedom of belief a basic human right. That expectation did not come from preserving ancient rules about religious loyalty. It developed from the recognition that identity and conscience cannot be controlled without harming individual dignity. The history of apostasy laws shows how teachings designed to protect community unity in earlier centuries became harder to justify once societies began to value personal freedom as part of moral responsibility. Number 6. Disease was treated as divine punishment. Another religious teaching that aged badly is the idea that disease is primarily a punishment from God, or a sign of spiritual failure rather than a biological condition that requires medical understanding. This belief shaped how communities responded to illness for centuries and often delayed the development and acceptance of effective treatment. In many ancient religious traditions, sickness was interpreted as a moral message. The Hebrew Bible sometimes connected disease with disobedience to divine law and described epidemics as consequences of collective These explanations reflected the limited medical knowledge available at the time, but they were preserved as part of sacred teaching rather than temporary attempts to explain unfamiliar events. Early Christian communities also interpreted illness through spiritual frameworks. Disease could be described as a test of faith, a result of sin, or a condition requiring repentance. Prayer and ritual healing were often treated as primary responses before systematic medical treatment became widely available. Over time, this approach influenced how European societies reacted to epidemics, especially during periods when scientific explanations of infection did not yet exist. Islamic societies historically supported both spiritual interpretation and medical study at the same time, but religious explanations for illness still remained influential in many communities. Even when physicians made important advances in understanding anatomy and treatment, popular belief often continued to connect sickness with divine intention rather than biological causes. This pattern shows how religious meaning and medical explanation sometimes existed together instead of replacing each other. The problem appears when spiritual explanations begin to replace medical responsibility rather than exist alongside it. When disease is treated mainly as punishment or testing, attention shifts away from prevention and treatment and toward moral judgment. In several historical outbreaks, communities blamed victims for their suffering instead of investigating the causes of infection or improving public health conditions. This response slowed progress because it redirected energy toward interpreting meaning instead of solving problems. Modern medicine changed this situation by introducing evidence-based explanations for illness through observation, experimentation, and vaccination. Germ theory demonstrated that many diseases spread through microorganisms rather than through moral failure. Public sanitation systems reduced infection rates in growing cities. Antibiotics and vaccines transformed survival rates across the world. These changes did not depend on interpreting illness as a spiritual message. They depended on studying the body and environment directly. This shift created a philosophical challenge for older assumptions about the purpose of suffering. If disease can be prevented through sanitation and vaccination, then it becomes difficult to explain illness primarily as divine punishment. If treatment works regardless of a person's moral condition, then the connection between sickness and spiritual judgment becomes weaker as a general explanation. Medical success therefore changed how societies understood responsibility for health. Today, most people accept that illness should be addressed through science, public health policy, and access to treatment rather than through moral interpretation alone. Religious meaning may still exist for individuals who experience suffering, but it no longer functions as the main explanation for why disease occurs. The transition from punishment-based explanations to biological understanding shows how religious teaching sometimes preserved earlier assumptions long after better evidence became available. And if this video provided you with some value, please consider liking the video and subscribing to Reason Over Rituals. You can also turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future uploads. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.